Frank, what are your thoughts about that? Is that sort of thing really go on in the world today?
Oh yes, I'm going to bring one thing, a little note. When Harriman was in charge of negotiations in the Asian theater, he was dealing with the Laos, and he was trying to convince them to go into a coalition government with the communists. And General Pom, and he pointed a finger at every member of the Laos delegation, and he told them, I want you to know that if you don't go along with my bidding, which was the United States bidding and the big money boys, you will be responsible for the destruction of your countries. And General Pom replied to him, you know, Government Harriman, we in Laos have many years' experience of colonial rule, but we were never spoken to in quite that fashion in colonial times. And that goes to show you, and then Cabot Lodge set up for the assassination of the Diem brothers. And this goes to show you, you know, and there we had thousands of American boys getting killed in Vietnam.
In war, we never tried to win. In fact, all during the war, while we financed the North Vietnamese so that they could finance the Viet Cong, so they could kill our boys, just like we did in Germany. We'll be back in just a moment here.
While the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free.
Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Frank, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but because the computer tells me what to do. Anyway, you were telling us the story about Laos, and of course the tragedy, and of course we did eventually betray Laos. We did eventually betray, of course, Cambodia, and we betrayed Vietnam, and basically, of course, these people, they just wanted to be free. They wanted to be free of colonial rule. They wanted to establish their own governments, and we turned them over to the communists. That's what's so unconscionable. Go ahead, Frank.
Now, the bottom line is this. When you talk about the big business in Germany and everything else, I went to buy a shirt a couple of weeks ago. And where do you think it was made?
Thailand?
Vietnam.
Where was it?
In Vietnam it was made.
I'm not surprised. In fact, we've given the most favored nation treaty status. They never gave our boys back. I mean, they're still holding many of our boys, if they're not already dead. They knew this. Kissinger knew it. The people in government knew it. McCain knew it. Kerry knew it. And they were all, of course, did everything they could to cover up the fact that the Vietnamese were holding, at least back in the late 1990s, were American soldiers left over from the Second World War, and they were simply betrayed by our leaders.
You're absolutely correct.
Okay, fine. Of course, the average American soldier would do anything to help a fellow soldier, and we have it within the military, the idea of you never leave your men behind. But our leaders have a different agenda, and in every one of the wars, they always abandon some of our men, turn them over to the enemy, and leave them there to die a slow, painful death. They did in the First World War. They did in the Second World War. They did it in the Korean War. They did it in the Vietnam War. And if you doubt that, we have a report from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that gives you the whole background of that. It's available through Radio Liberty. Totally suppressed by the controlled media, but it came out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The Republican representatives on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's available through Radio Liberty. We'll tell you more about that a little bit later. We hope you'll want to get that report. But we abandoned thousands, probably at least 20,000 men during the Second World War, young men who went overseas to fight for freedom, never realizing, of course, we were financing our enemy, and they were simply going to be sacrificed and left to die in the gulags in the frozen wasteland of Russia. We'll be back in just a moment with our special guest right here at Radio Liberty as we talk about Bella Dodd and world communism. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Our guest this evening, Dr. Edgar Lucidi and Frank Vasali. And Frank had actually known Bella Dodd and certainly verifies the story that I'd heard. And I tell, at least in my book, that certainly a high official in the Communist Party was told that, if there was ever a problem during the Second World War, American members of the Communist Party wanted to know what the official party line was, why they were to contact people living at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, Waldorf Astoria in New York City, and of course some of the largest and most powerful and wealthy men in America would tell her, Bella Dodd, what the official Communist Party line was. Well, our telephone number is 1-888-24-LIBERTY, 1-888-24-LIBERTY, or 464-8295. If you have a question for either one of our guests, do either one of you have a website? What most Americans find it so difficult to believe is that we would finance our enemies, but right here in the United States, they finance the right, they finance the left, they finance the Republicans, they finance the Democrats, they finance the liberals, they finance the conservatives. Why should we be surprised at all that we would be financing our enemies, both before and during the wars that have been fought? And you go in the background of World War I, you go in the background of World War II, and that's beautifully laid out, certainly in the book called America's Nazi Secret by John Loftus, available through Radio Liberty. And remember, John had a security clearance 3 times higher than top security. He had the top security clearance in the nation, and got into the files that nobody else could. And of course, they wouldn't let him tell the truth for at least 30 years. Well, it wasn't until this year that he was actually able to tell the full story and put this into the book, which we carry, America's Nazi Secret, How We Financed the Communists all during World War II, because we have covered in the book, it's near Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler by Professor Sutton, and then Trading with the Enemy by Charles Hyam. That's Trading with the Enemy by Charles Hyam. All 3 books are available from Radio Liberty. We want people to understand that nothing is it appears to be. Certainly, do either one of you have a comment on how we're going to be able to reach the American people and get them to change their worldview? The trouble is that we have these ideas, and they are who we are. And when, of course, we try to tell people what's really going on, people look at you as you've got holes in your head. I know, because I used to be one of those people who thought that people who talk like I do today, or talk about the things you talk about, they've got to be wrong, because I had a college degree, and I had an advanced degree and a doctorate and a Phi Beta Kappa Key, and I thought I was pretty smart. I didn't realize how totally unaware I was of the history of my nation, or how we'd got into the situation we're in. Do either one of you have any suggestions of how we're going to get this information out? Because I know both of you feel very deeply about the fact that we're losing our country. How are we going to reach the American people? How are we going to inform them? How are we going to get them concerned? And how are we going to expose the subversive element that controls the leadership of both political parties?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I will give you a personal experience. It wasn't until I was 40 that I began to realize that everything that my grandfather had said when I was a young boy was correct. And he was a very politically astute person, and he knew more about international politics with his limited education than I, who had graduated from college and from medical school, knew. And gradually I realized that when I was age 40 that he was really correct and I was wrong, and that I had learned the wrong things. And unfortunately in school they don't teach the right things. They don't teach the students how to think, how to analyze situations. They just spoon feed them. They say, and the nature of the testing is that way. For example, they might give a multiple choice question, and but they will limit it. They will limit the choices to 1 or 2 or 3. Well, how about neither? For example, many years ago, the epithet was that you're against communism, but better red than dead. That was the answer that they would give me. And I used to answer, well, how about neither? How about neither red nor dead? So I remember the first few years of school, we used to have to give essay-type answers. The questions would be phrased in such a way that we would have to discuss it in an essay-type fashion. This taught one to not only that he had to know the facts, but he had to present them logically and in a persuasive style. But after a while, the tests were done true or false or multiple choice. And I feel that the problem begins with proper education. The government controls the educational system in this country, and they determine which books and what the books are to say. And there's very little true historical knowledge garnered, and he who forgets history is doomed to repeat it. For example, you mentioned that the U.S. interest and others finance both sides of the conflict. Well, this is an age-old program going back to the Roman Empire, where their concept, their motto was to divide and conquer. And they knew that a people united would be difficult to conquer. So whenever they would see a revolutionary movement in the country, in another country, they would foster it.
So that's exactly, of course, what we've done over there in the Middle East. We financed this Muslim Brotherhood, in fact.
But they would foster it up to a certain point. If the party that they were fostering got too strong, then they fostered the opposing party.
And we see that since when they created the country of Iraq. What did they do? They took three competing and fighting factions, the Shia Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, and the Kurds, and put them into one country so they could never be a united country. There would always be divisions so that they could manipulate that country, and they could always manipulate the leaders of this. These techniques are used so effectively today, and of course this is what that's what they did in certainly in Palestine, where the Mossad and the CIA created Hamas. Hamas, of course, was an organization, a radical Islamic organization in opposition to the Palestinian Liberation Army. But you see, if you could have them fighting among themselves, they could never be effective. Well, then, of course, Hamas gets started out of line, so you've got to, of course, build a counter to Hamas. And it's the oldest game of the world, and it's so obvious to people like Dr. Lucidi and Frank Vasali, and our listeners out there have to understand this is exactly what's going on. I have to smile every time I hear President Obama talking about wanting to tax the rich. President Obama raised more money for his presidential candidacy than any other person in all of history, almost $500 million. Where did the money come from? Goldman Sachs, George Soros, all the multimillionaires pouring money into Barack Obama's campaign, and he tells us he wants to tax the rich. I mean, you're not really serious, are you? But people believe it. After all, they've got so much money, we ought to tax them, and then we won't have to tax the individuals. Basically, because what we're doing is we're not taxing anybody. We're just creating money out of nothing. We're borrowing it from future generations. This year, $1.65 trillion we're going to borrow just so we can pay our debts. And of course, remember it took 200 years for America to amass $1 trillion in debt. This year, we'll increase our debt $1.65 trillion in 1 year under Barack Obama. And he's